So, welcome to Spectral Evolution's webinar series. Today, we're going to be hosting Henry Crawford. He's a PhD candidate from the University of British Columbia, and we're going to be talking about detection of Cryptotephra in sedimentary profiles using reflectance spectroscopy. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Mackenzie Woodman. I'm our application specialist. And I'll be introducing Spectral Evolution before we get started with Henry. So Spectral Evolution is the leading manufacturer of UV-Vis, NIR spectrometers and spectroradiometers for field use. They're full range instruments from 350 nanometers to 2500 nanometers, and we were established in 2004. We are located in the Haverhill or Boston area in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and so we're made in America. And our primary applications are in hyperspectral applications, remote sensing and vegetation, mining and geology, as well as photonics and calibration transfers. Today, we're going to be focusing mainly on our geology application, which is primarily used with our ORExpert or OREx series of instruments or spectrometers. So our guest speaker today is Henry Crawford. Like I said, he's a PhD candidate from the University of British Columbia in their Geological Sciences department and Hyperspectral Earth Observations department. Henry Crawford is a geomorphologist and PhD candidate in Geological Sciences. Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences in Vancouver, Canada. He uses multi and hyperspectral data to uncover clues to how and why landscapes evolve, integrating satellite imagery, UAV surveys, and lab spectroscopy. His recent work applies reflectance spectroscopy to reveal hidden volcanic ash in sediments and refine landform chronologies in the Canadian Rockies and Central Andes. And so he'll tell you more about that coming up, and I'll let Henry take it away from here. And we'll have a questions and comment section afterwards, as usual. Thank you very much. Thanks, Henry.
Yep. So, thank you for the introduction. I know you're all busy, so thank you for joining me here today. Before I begin, I would like to first thank my co-authors of this study, Morris, Mitch, Sam, and Olaf from the Universities of Hong Kong, the University of British Columbia, where I am, and the University of the Fraser Valley, also here in British Columbia, Canada. And I'd also like to recognize that much of the field work I will be presenting on was conducted on the beautiful and traditional territories of several First Nations groups here in Canada. And I'd like to thank the Natural Resources team of the Bonaparte First Nations specifically for assisting access to and their help at several field sites. But also the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada for funding of some of this work and instruments. And lastly, the Scientific Journal of Geomorphology for publishing this work that can be shared in detail after the webinar. And so for some background, I'm a geomorphologist. So I'm concerned with how landscapes change and evolve, and I spend much of my time outdoors mapping and dating landforms. In fact, mapping and dating landforms is a fundamental need for many geomorphic investigations, from which we can interpret how and when landscapes have shifted over time in context of past environments compared to modern day. And so one way geomorphologists and many other types of field scientists obtain age control in sediments is using tephrochronology. So when explosive volcanoes erupt, we can imagine that they distribute widespread plumes of volcanic ash, or tephra, across continents and even globally. And then after landfall, these tephra layers become buried in stratigraphy, as you can kind of see in this photograph here. If preserved and later found, these ancient tephra layers can offer precise and immediate age control dating thousands of years old. And this is because eruptions occur at a single point in time. And so tephra then spreads over large regions, and its position in the sedimentary record kind of records that timestamp. And so this is really useful for interpreting the timing of landscape formation and stratigraphy. Unfortunately, fine-grained tephras are frequently obscured within the sedimentary deposits, such as in this photo in the bottom right. Particularly smaller or more distant eruptions might leave only trace amounts of ash fallout, known as Cryptotephra, when layers are visually indistinguishable from surrounding sediments. And moreover, post-depositional processes can rework tephra, dispersing it into thin horizons or diluting it within the host sediments. And so this can complicate and sometimes completely prevent the detection of Cryptotephra in the field. Yet, if such Cryptotephra horizons could be detected, they would expand the scope of tephrochronology by increasing the number of useful deposits. And so, tephra normally consists of a mix of volcanic glass, crystalline minerals, and lithic fragments from the eruption, as we kind of see here in this backscatter image, kind of zooming in on a really small fragment of this tephra horizon. The arrow points to a really small glass shard, about less than a quarter millimeter thick, in white, but also pieces of minerals and rocks within that sample. And this presents an opportunity because we know that reflectance spectroscopy can characterize the mineral composition of a sample, such as rock, sediment, or soil, by detecting unique patterns of reflected light or spectra across the visible and non-visible wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. In fact, great scientific work has already shown that tephra can be accurately and sensitively measured using spectroradiometers in laboratory settings. This includes compositional variations in silica and ferromagnesium minerals, as well as alkali metal oxides. And this is just an example reflectance profile with wavelength on the x-axis through both the visible, near-infrared, and shortwave infrared wavelengths against reflectance on the y-axis, kind of demonstrating what a typical tephra spectral profile might look like. And so therefore, reflectance spectroscopy ought to be capable of detecting the presence of tephra even in low concentration cryptotephra mixed within sediment deposits in field settings, which is yet to be shown. And so here, and what I'll show you, is how we test the extent to which reflectance spectroscopy can be used as a rapid and field deployable tool for identifying cryptotephra in geomorphic settings. We'll demonstrate how to detect these invisible layers within sedimentary profiles up to several meters thick, and we'll use a tephra-sensitive spectral metric that we developed using experimental mixtures of tephra and host sediments in the lab. And so, to do this, we collect samples from across Western Canada. This region contains many landforms and sediments that archive paleoenvironmental change, including glacial outwash, alluvial deposits, alluvial fans, and river terrace deposits. And embedded within these landforms are three prominent tephras that serve as important age markers for studies in this region. So if found, these are the Mazama ash from what is now Crater Lake, the Mount St. Helens young ash from Mount St. Helens in Washington State, and the Bridge River ash from Mount Meager in British Columbia. And we can see the widespread distribution of each of these ashes in the map here, extending across Western North America. And our field sites that we go to specifically are where these white stars are. And so at the first field site near Banff National Park in Alberta, there's a well-studied sedimentary outcrop known to contain all three of these tephras. And so a picture of the outcrop at Windy Point here in the middle demonstrates how the oldest tephra, the Mazama ash, is preserved the deepest down. Then a thin layer of the St. Helens tephra in the middle, and the youngest tephra of the Bridge River towards the surface. Just 2 kilometers away, at a similar outcropping, shown here in this photograph on the right, we find just the Mazama ash and the Bridge River tephras. However, in principle, these should bracket the St. Helens young tephra based on the known age constraints. Perhaps the St. Helens young tephra is preserved as a cryptotephra layer, and this presents a wonderful opportunity for us to test our hypothesis. And so what we did is we scanned each outcrop using a Spectral Evolution PSR 3500, which collects reflectance measurements between 350 and 2500 nanometer wavelengths. Specifically, we collected dry sediment samples at every 5 centimeter depth. We passed these samples through a 0.1 millimeter sieve to reduce grain size biases in the measurements. And then we took triplicate average scans at each horizon. And so we also collected and scanned pure end members of each of the 3 tephras that we found at the study site. There, and at new sites across Western Canada, we also collected hundreds of in situ reflectance measurements of typical no tephra sediments that comprise many of the landforms in this study, so including alluvial sediments, glacial outwash, and aeolian deposits. And these are some examples of reflectance spectra of our end-member samples, including the 3 tephras in gray and host sediments in color. The x-axis here is wavelength from 350 to 2500 nanometers, which includes the visible colors to the left, but also thousands of invisible colors into the near-infrared and shortwave infrared, which also characterize the sediments. So on the y-axis, on the top panel, we have percent reflectance of light. We can see that the end-member spectra are similar, but resemble slightly different patterns. The patterns of mineral-specific absorptions become clearer if we remove the overall brightness curve, as seen in the lower plot. And here we can start to make out subtle differences between tephras in gray and host sediments in color. To investigate these spectral differences further, in the lab, we physically mixed 8 different tephra and host sediment end members. You can kind of see here in this photograph, the paleosols as 100% on the left, and the Bridge River ash as 100% tephra on the right. We kind of mixed them incrementally from 0 to 100%. And so we did this again for 8 different mixtures. And this resulted in nearly 500 unique mixes of tephra or Cryptotephra abundance. Then compared how the reflectance changes with tephra abundance. So in this plot, with wavelength again on the x-axis and the continuum removed reflectance on the y-axis, you can see several distinct absorptions associated with specific mineral features in both tephra, shown in gray, when pure, and host sediments, shown as brown when pure. Several of these absorptions shift with tephra abundance. And these absorptions were characterized using standard metrics like feature depth, area, and width, and each metric was numerically correlated against the known tephra quantity. And so the best performing metrics were combined into a comprehensive tephra-sensitive spectral index, which we call T-spectral. And T-spectral is principally associated with the hydrated and often iron-rich glass comprising tephra, compared to the more variable host sediments. And so that's these 2 features here, kind of associated with, again, mineral-bound water, but as well as silica hydroxyl groups found in the volcanic glass. And we standardized each mixing experiment. We grouped all measurements into 5 weight percent tephra bins and calibrated T-spectral using a linear model to predict the abundance of tephra within each sample. We can see that here with our index on the x-axis and the actual tephra abundance on the y-axis, that there is strong model performance for quantifying tephra concentration using this index T-spectral. However, it's entirely likely that false predictions could, conceivably still occur in sediments that have similar compositions to tephra. And so using those hundreds of in situ field samples of our deposits throughout Western Canada, prediction confidence was assessed as the likelihood of pure host sediments, which contain no tephra, falsely predicting some tephra concentration. And so we can see that while false positives are centered near 0 weight percent on the x-axis here, signal overlap results in 1, 2, and 3 standard deviation thresholds at about 7, 16, and 25 weight percent tephra respectively. These kind of false prediction expectations are binned according to the geomorphic unit that we were scanning, and then kind of on the left, and then kind of compared to the predictions using the index to our end member tephras on the right. And so these empirical thresholds, they provide a basis for kind of assessing the prediction confidence of using T-spectral, at least within Western Canadian field settings. And so using this model, profiles of tephra concentration were predicted for the sedimentary outcrops scanned in Alberta that we saw earlier. And so on the left, we can see that the model accurately predicts high abundances of tephra for all visible layers. So again, we have our St. Helens, our Mazama, which is not shown here in this figure, but Mazama ash below, the visible St. Helens young ash, which is currently mixed in with some sediments at about 40%, and then the visible Bridge River ash, predicting at about 100 weight percent, and with some mixing kind of seen above that horizon. Again, that's that plot here on the left. And on the right, we have the Mazama and Bridge River ashes, visible and clearly predicted as well. But remember that these two tephra layers should, in principle, bracket a non-visible cryptotephra from the Mount St. Helens eruption if preserved. In fact, we now see a concentration spike of about 17 weight percent tephra with strong confidence against that background noise. And this is a really exciting result for us because we've now identified a completely new cryptotephra that would have otherwise been missed and has been missed in previous studies. To validate our results, we sent a sample of this layer to an independent lab at Washington State University. There, they confirmed the presence of volcanic glass in this backscatter image to the left. And furthermore, we use this image to quantify glass abundance within error of our spectral-based prediction. So this is also a really excellent result. And lastly, the lab matched the geochemical fingerprint of this cryptotephra to the Mount St. Helens young eruption, kind of confirming our expectations. However, another pressing question does remain in terms of model transferability. And so therefore, we tested our spectral model in a completely new region against a completely new tephra and alluvial sediments. And so here in the Sierra de Acanquija of Northwest Argentina, we use the spectral model to correlate nearby alluvial surfaces for mapping. Specifically, we hope to determine if an adjacent alluvial surface that has been incised by a modern river gully is in fact a part of the same geologic unit. And so as you can kind of see here on the right, the already dated geologic unit to the north has embedded within it a characteristic and bright Holocene tephra. It's kind of this white and bright layer over on the right-hand side of the picture here. Yet this layer is absent from the adjacent surface just to the south. So again, possibly preserved as a cryptotephra. And if we can find this cryptotephra in the unit to the south, we can kind of definitely relate these two geologic units to one another for mapping. And so, applying the same T-spectral model with prediction confident limits now standardized to sediments of this region, we predict the abundance of tephra in both the northern and southern alluvial outcrops. We can see a distinct 100% tephra prediction at the visible horizon to the north, and excitingly, a 30% abundance of tephra in the outcrop with no visible ash to the south. So because of this, we can now conclude that although mixed and diffuse, the Holocene ash is also present within the alluvial unit to the south, and can therefore be confidently correlated to the already mapped and dated unit to the north. So that saves us a lot of time. And in conclusion, reflectance spectroscopy, we can kind of determine that reflectance spectroscopy can in fact detect cryptotephra in field outcrops at low abundances, and that mixing experiments can quantify tephra using signals of hydrated glass and iron in their spectra. And because of this, a new Mount St. Helens young cryptotephra is now found and identified at Abraham Lake in Alberta. And remobilized cryptotephra in stratigraphy can now be used to aid the correlation of sediments and landforms quickly in the field. And so, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you would like more details on this work, please find the publication in the scientific journal Geomorphology. It's fully open access. And so please contact me with any questions on this publication or the presentation, or if you're interested in any type of collaboration. And I'll now open it up for questions. Thank you.